Hi, Joe.
Hi, Lisa.
How are you guys?
I just noticed something that I
What?
have to change that I hadn't realized was there. It says MMT in the public purpose with Joe Firestone. I have to ask Fran to change that.
That's not what I see. It says me too. Has my name there.
Oh, on the promo, yeah, your name is on the promo. Okay, but your name is not on the introductory fair thing, fanfare
Oh,
thing that ends up with MMT in the public purpose with Joe Firestone.
oh, that would be good. It'd be nice to have my name out there.
I will, I, I will send it to Fran afterwards. It was originally done by Jimmy. I'll see whether Fran can change it and put your name in. If not, I'll go to Jimmy and ask her to change it.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, we are live, and here we are talking about uh,
Promos.
promos. Yeah,
I think we're allowed for a minute. So
I
we're going
think
to talk about inflation tonight, huh?
we're going to talk about inflation and specifically the MMT views, K, on inflation.
Mm-hmm. And then
Okay.
we're going to go practicality, right?
Well, we're going to go any way we want.
Okay.
Okay.
Practical application, Joe. You know that, Professor.
Yes, practical application counts. So Dolores is here. Hello,
Hi,
Dolores.
Doris.
Okay, and Arif Hassan from Liberia is here.
Hi, welcome back, Karif.
Have you seen Arif before?
I have. He was on. I believe it might not have been the MMT Tuesday last week, but I think it was. I've seen him once before.
Okay, anyway, welcome back, Arif. Uh, so, well, he can make comments, of course. He's not a part of the broadcast.
Yeah, it would be nice though. I mean, I've had friends from Liberia when I lived in Seattle, and that's a fascinating viewpoint. Liberia watching, looking in on us. Fascinating and appropriate as such, right? Especially with what's going on.
Yes. Hi, Lana, and thank you for sharing. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you very much for sharing.
Let me go out. I'm going to share too because I didn't do that.
Okay. Well, you can go on and share because I'm going to bring in some articles that I've got in. Actually, I converted them to Acrobat. I want to start with something from Stephanie Kelton.
That's where I saw that from. Okay. I struggle sometimes to keep, not enough RAM. I keep dumping details and then I get myself in trouble.
I'm going to share the screen on this one. It's not something on the web. It is. Here we go. This is a piece by Stephanie Kelton
Put her up
from
on screen, Joe.
her Substack, okay, which is the Lens. Thank you. I will put her on there. Let me go back to it. Thank you for reminding me.
No problem.
I have this habit of not sticking it in, but there it is. So let me find the Acrobat in. Does it work the same way the other one does? I don't know. Anyway, so this was something Stephanie did in her Substack. And she was trying to answer a question. There were a number of questions that had occurred in a Brussels presentation. And she was going to answer them all after she got back, to the United States. Anyway, the first question was, you say that the deficit can be too big, that inflation could be evidence of a deficit that's too big. Is the deficit too big? If that is the case, shouldn't Congress pass immediate tax hikes or spending cuts? Would it be politically impossible? And so Steph goes to some basics first. She says, let's start with the first part of the question. It's certainly true that government deficits can be too big. No MMT economist has ever disputed that, which is an absolutely true statement, by the way. What we have argued from the very beginning is that contra conventional arguments about budget deficits and fiscal sustainability, the relevant constraint on government spending is inflation. I, by the way, remember that from my first experience, with MMT, and specifically the Fiscal Sustainability Conference that we held on April 28, 2010, at which Stephanie presented, and Bill Mitchell presented, and Randy Ray presented, and a few others presented also. But the basic point is, everybody was quite clear. The relevant constraint on government spending is inflation. Stephanie quotes from Randy Ray. It says, clearly, from something Randy Ray did in 2009, it would clearly be inflationary to keep pushing the deficit beyond the level required to achieve full employment. But up to the point of full employment, deficits are not necessarily inflationary. Still, policy needs to be aware of bottlenecks and other structural problems that can generate inflation even before full employment. There are 3 points here, says Stephanie. 3 points implicit in what Randy is saying. Number one, when there is untapped capacity in the economy, i.e., unemployed labor, idle or underutilized factories and equipment, and readily available raw materials, government deficits are not inherently inflationary. And then she says, e.g., 2000 and 2020. What she's saying to us is that during the period 2000 to 2020, there were deficits for almost the whole time. I believe the year 2000 was a surplus year. I can't recall whether 2001 was a surplus year or not. But every year thereafter, up to 2020, the government went ahead and ran deficits in each of those years. And inflation was very low in each of those years. In fact, the Fed was having trouble getting to its inflation target of 2%. It was struggling to get to 2%. And many years, it did not get to its target of 2%. Number two, inflation can begin to accelerate even before the economy runs out of spare capacity. And here her example is what happened in 2000, and 21 during COVID. The economy had not run out of spare capacity, yet inflation was beginning to accelerate. And her third point is that government deficits that attempt to push an economy beyond full employment will push prices higher. And her example there is World War II. We went beyond full employment in World War II, we were at rates of roughly 1% employment, which, when you consider the friction of people moving from job to job, at that point, full employment was probably 2% or so. For the period of the war, we were below full employment constantly. These aren't controversial points, says Stephanie, even among mainstream economists, yet they often get lost in the popular discourse. For example, it's not uncommon to hear lawmakers, media pundits, and other commentaries refer to deficits as evidence of overspending, quote unquote, as if they naturally embody higher inflation. So it's important to remember that government deficits, even big ones, can coexist alongside low inflation or even outright deflation for prolonged periods of time. And another example she gives, that was the situation in Japan for the last 3 decades. God help us, that's 30 years. So that example, of course, by itself falsifies the idea that deficits alone are evidence, of overspending. And here's a graphic from the Fed. And what that graphic shows is that in Japan, inflation and consumer prices for Japan were running about anywhere from lower than zero to what looks like it's about 2.7% on that graph. For much of the time, inflation was below zero. In other words, it was deflationary. While in most of those years, they were running substantial deficits, sometimes 10% of GDP. The blue line is the deficit line. Okay, the red line is the inflation line, the line of consumer prices, for Japan. So you see the example in statistical form. And then she says that until COVID came along, it was also the US experience without the deflation. Like Japan, the US experienced decades of persistent fiscal deficits with little pressure on inflation. Even as the deficit surged above 10% in the wake of the Great Recession, the Fed's preferred inflation member, core PCE, that's personal consumer expenditures, averaged just 1.6%. I told you they were having trouble making 2%. From 2009 to 2019. And there the blue line is the PCE, personal consumer expenditures. And the red line is the deficits, which started out as a surplus, of course, then went into deficit. What was the year for that? Probably 2001 is when it crossed over, into deficits, just before 2002. And then we were in deficit all the time. And in 2009, we were at 10%, of GDP. And in 2020, we went to 15%, of GDP for deficits. And you see, 1.6% of inflation, almost constant. So deficits by themselves are not evidence, of inflation. You have to actually look at the prices. So then Stephanie says, so MMT urges us to think about the economy's productive capacity when we're talking about the limits on spending. And it reminds us that government spending is only one component of total expenditure. Any claim on an economy's productive capacity that comes from government spending has to mix in with household consumption, business investment, and net exports. And she says it's aggregate demand relative to productive capacity that matters when it comes to so called overheating. When demand leakages rob the economy of too much demand, even large fiscal deficits may not move the needle on inflation. So, what are leakages? They are trade deficits, current account deficits. That's a leakage of money to other nations because we're importing more from them than we're exporting to them. And then there's also personal savings. In other words, personal savings take money out of the economy and leave it in banks. And there were, by the way, many years during the 2000 to 2020 period when personal savings, were very high. But just after the recession, when government deficits started to climb, uh, we had situations where personal savings rose to 6% of GDP and 7%, okay, of GDP. So that was a leakage, okay. And if you looked at the magnitude of the leakage to savings and the magnitude of the leakage to trade, then even a deficit of 10% did not cause inflation.
There's couple of things that are running through my head, Joe, and I just want to throw them out here. And they might not be good. This might not be a good time to go down either one of these paths, but I just want to throw them out here because they're banging on my head right now. One of
Okay.
them is that there was a huge personal credit uh, increase in that period of time,
Yes.
and there was also a lot of offshoring that was going on during that time, and thus those are some impacts that I just need to throw that out there because they would impact this a little differently than what we've talked about, right?
Yes, they would. Okay. If credit is so loose and people are taking so much credit,
Mm-hmm.
then the private banks are creating lots of money for the economy,
Mm-hmm.
which can manifest itself in demand that is increasing.
Right.
So, with the banks operating at full bore and the government itself having a deficit of 10%, then there was a rebound out of the recession that was going to take place. The strange thing, though, about that particular rebound is that it was the slowest rebound we've had since the Second World War. It was famous for that.
Well, yeah, because even though they loosen credit up for the consumer, you bury a consumer in debt. Yes, you fuel consumption, domestic, well, any consumption, right? Which would also then potentially, because at the time wages were, at least in the professional sector, wages were doing fairly well. In the finance sector, they certainly were anyway.
They certainly
Um,
were in the finance sector, yeah.
and those were the people too in the, climbing the ladder in the middle of a career, right? In the finance sector,
Yes.
uh, Credit was readily available, but the demand for foreign goods, the consumption of foreign goods at the time, was also high. Travel was uh, fairly simple, not necessarily too expensive. People were moving and shaking, and they were all over the place. Business was booming. It was prior to the tax restraints that were put on around business expenses, blah, 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 right? So there were a lot of things going on here. And then I throw in the fact that there was a lot of offshoring going on because it was offshoring of service jobs at that point, right? So you had people who were making decent money still considered, maybe not the managerial pool, but they were working in the finance sector with very viable jobs that all of a sudden it was deemed that a monkey could do them, and we're going to get rid of the whole team, right?
right? And
Which didn't go well, but they did it anyway.
right, some of those jobs, okay, were offshored to India,
Lots of them, tons of them.
or to Mexico, especially in the software area. Okay, and lots of people were cut. But one point, okay, I'd like to mention,
But that's production mojo. They were sending all call center help offshore,
they were.
all of it. I
They,
mean,
I remember
boom.
that. Yes, yes, I know. Okay, it was very tough. What you see there, that particular deficit of 10% in 2009, at the peak of the Obama deficit. I guess it went up a little. Oh no, I'm sorry. That was the largest deficit. I think it was actually 10.4 or 10.5%, okay, of GDP. That deficit was too small because I remember savings in that year, personal savings was something like 7%. That's a leakage, okay, out of the economy. Now, in some previous years, the current account deficit was 5%, maybe 6%, or something like that. But after the crash of 2008, the level of importing fell to something like 2%, okay, of GDP.
Hmm.
So there's a leakage of 2% of GDP there. There's a leakage of 7% to savings. So that means the leakages are 9%, and the additions by government are 10%. So the net addition by government to net financial assets there going into the economy, the active economy, is only 1% of GDP.
Hmm.
That's why the recovery was so slow, because even though we looked at that deficit and we said, oh, what a gigantic deficit, it wasn't near the deficit that we should have had. And that's why the recovery was so slow. And the reason why we didn't have a larger deficit was because Obama was conservative about his deficits. He didn't want to go over $1 trillion, okay, of deficit.
That was the decade of we're going to have to tighten our belts. That was the speech on how, uh, you know, America needs to pay its credit card bills and the like.
That was, yeah, he made actually not just a single speech on that, but he tried to persuade us that we were out of money. He evidently didn't understand or didn't want to tell us,
Had Summers in his ear, whatever.
as Summers in his ear, that we create the money when we spend. He didn't want people to know that. So
It's so confusing
Obama
as to what the narrative really was because, I mean, it's becoming more and more evident when it comes to economics. The party line politics has nothing to do with reality.
yes, yes, it's
Zero.
a narrative, it's a dream, it's a story.
They're trying to drive behavior with the garbage they put in people's ears. That's really what it comes down to.
That is what it comes down to. They're manipulating, highly manipulative. Okay, so back to Stephanie's piece. I will go back to Stephanie's piece now and pull it up so I can see the rest of what's going on here. It's short. It won't be too much longer. So demand leakages, that was actually a good thing to look at. So she says, getting back to the question, the answer is yes. Fiscal deficits can be too big, and inflation can be evidence of a deficit that has gotten too big. But that is not, and this is really important, she emphasizes, tantamount to saying that any increase in inflation is de facto evidence of a deficit that is too big. Government deficits are only one potential source of inflationary pressure. And that's what we just were talking about here. In other words, if you remember, even that deficit of 10% did not create inflation in the United States.
Mm-mm.
It was running at
No,
one.
because it really only had a net effect of 1%.
Yep. It's always possible for CPI or PPI. CP is Consumer Price Index. PPI is the Producer Price Index. And the PC is the Personal Consumer Expenditures, again, to rise for reasons unrelated to swings in the fiscal deficit. My view is that the American Rescue Plan, the ARP Act 2021, March 2021, which reduced unemployment and boosted real GDP growth, had only a modest impact on overall inflation. That's also what the chief economist and his team at Moody's Analytics have found. Chief economist is Mark Bazandi. He's a very well-known Republican macroeconomist. And he's a favorite one for Stephanie to quote because he often agrees with her, in spite of the fact that his bona fides with some of the Republicans are very, very strong. He said, okay, aggressive fiscal policy was the key to ending the pandemic recession and behind the quickness of the recovery. The controversial American Rescue Plan helped avoid a double dip, and it has not actually materially added to the high inflation, and while costly, would have been as costly to taxpayers without it. Stephanie.
Costly in what sense, though, Joe? What I guess I'm a little. I need to flesh
Well,
that out.
from Mark Zandi's point of view, of course, he is, not an MMTer.
Oh, okay,
As well,
okay,
costly, he's talking about the deficit.
okay, yeah, uh-huh. Because yeah, whatever. I can't. I have no patience for these kinds of things anymore. But okay, go ahead.
Okay. Even if you believe the American Rescue Plan was much too big, the reality is that the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, had just announced that the federal budget deficit is expected to shrink to $1 trillion in 2022. That's fiscal 2022. That's this year. We got 3 months to go in this fiscal year, ends September 30th.
And they're going to shrink it by 1.8 trillion in
Yes.
3 months. Is that what they're saying?
Oh, no, that's not what they're saying. They're saying that from the beginning of this year,
Okay, okay. So 1.8 in a year. Got it.
1.8 trillion in a year. But she points out that is the most rapid collapse in the fiscal deficit in my lifetime. And to use a different word here, that is the most rapid collapse in fiscal support from the federal government in her lifetime. Because a fiscal deficit from the government is a net financial asset surplus in the private sector.
Right. So let me just let me just tie something in here. So is this related to what the Fed is doing with the procurement of the securities, the mortgage-backed securities?
No.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm pretty sure. This has to do with congressional action and the fact that Congress did not spend enough during the fiscal year beginning October 1st, 2022. The
Oh, they
American
didn't spend
Rescue
anything
Plan,
on the
remember,
people. Yeah.
yeah, the American Rescue Plan, okay, remember, was in fiscal year 2021.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, but in fiscal
Yep.
year 2022, there was only that silly little infrastructure bill that they got passed, and they probably haven't spent a hell of a lot of it up to this time. Okay,
Well, they probably, yeah, they haven't. And remember now, all of the money that they forked into some of those programs was hoarded and then put in the general funds of the state because it wasn't dispersed for the COVID, right? There were still hundreds of billions out there floating around that they told everybody that they could use on the police forces.
yeah, but that was from the CARES Act. They repurposed
Yeah,
the money that hadn't been spent, okay, in the CARES Act, and they put that into the police forces, but so they wouldn't be so afraid of the local populations across the United States.
but we still have to. There's so many levers here, Joe, because they're pumping money into the war machine right now.
They're pumping money into the war machine, but a good part of that money is spent. Well, I shouldn't say good part. It's not really that much because our troops, they haven't sent any more troops
Mm-mm.
overseas.
These are contracts, right?
Right. These are contracts, and a lot of that money is going to the American war machine here
Mm-hmm.
and is not being spent overseas. Uh,
Yeah, we're driving our own economy, basically.
yeah, military Keynesianism over here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So here's what I wrote back in March. She says the rapidly shrinking government deficit is acting as a drag on the economy. It's not nearly enough to snuff out the recovery because private sector demand has been strong enough to more than offset the fiscal drag. Still, the combined impact of state, local, and federal fiscal policy did shave an estimated 3.3 percentage points off of GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2021. Okay, so our GDP is what, 23 trillion per year. Okay, if you divide that roughly by four, you're looking at $800 billion. So in the fourth quarter of 2021, uh, $800 billion was shaved off of GDP. So then Stephanie says, in conclusion of that quote, Biden should be mindful about actively trying to shrink the deficit even faster.
And we have to remember too that this is what bothers me about all of these measures, Joe, is that we are all of this quote unquote recovery, it was really a reboot of the economy and the pent up, we're not talking about you and I having a great demand for stuff. We've got all kinds of things that were put on hold that are more up into the macro sense, or at least a sector outside of the households, right? Where supply chains have been strangled. We had a big problem with getting people back to work. I mean, we're not talking about the average gallop in the economic predicate here that all of these KPIs are based on. And I don't I'm not I'm the only reason I'm saying this is because it is very easy for and this is all I've seen, is to try and normalize what's going on here. Like the lowest unemployment ever in God knows when, right? Is all bullshit. There are more people that would rather be gainfully employed that aren't looking, right, now than there ever have been. And all we hear is how we created 8 million jobs. No, we just brought 8 million people back to work. We didn't actually create 8 million jobs. I'm sorry. I have a hard time with that. We reopened.
Yes, yes, we reopened, and we also have to remember something else. There were great shifts in spending
Mm-hmm.
due to COVID. People stayed home, and what they spent money on was goods. Whereas before COVID, they would have spent a lot of that money on services. So the service part of the economy was very dead in much
Strangled.
of COVID. Yeah, it was strangled by COVID. That's right. So the spending patterns were changed. And this, of course, also means the employment patterns, okay, were changed. All kinds of things happened, but during COVID, small businesses really took a hit.
And I don't often hear anybody give us tallies of how many actual small businesses bit the dirt. We don't talk about that at all. And those are important things because that speaks to who's unemployed that aren't counted in the unemployment numbers.
Right. And also, it speaks to business concentration.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
And monopolization and on and
right,
on.
right.
What do you
Okay.
call it?
Columns that were written during COVID would focus a lot on what was happening with business concentration. Okay. At the American Prospect, they were paying a lot of attention to that. Okay. At that
Yeah.
time. And there were hundreds of thousands of businesses that were lost. Okay. In that period. Okay. I don't know if it got to a million businesses, but an awful lot of small businesses went out, okay, of business
Oh man, I just thought of something
again
else, Joe.
by large business. Oh,
How,
please.
how many people did they throw out of their homes? I mean, if you're homeless, you're not unemployed because you don't count.
Uh, okay, there is a way to count that,
They don't count that in these normal measures, though.
but they estimate it, okay, and you can see that the labor force participation rate, as of right now, okay, I believe, and hang on a second, let me see if I can easily bring that up. I have something here, but I believe the number I saw was 0.637 for the labor participation rate. It's usually phrased as 1.637. Now, at the end of the Clinton administration, when things were going extremely well for the United States, for a short time anyway, the labor participation rate was 1.68. In other words, 68% of the possible number that could be employed, okay, were employed. Okay, at the end of this period, as of today, there's something like 63.7%. So there are 4.3% not participating in the workforce, 4.3% less than were participating in the workforce at the end of the Clinton administration. So that's a big loss of people who have withdrawn from the formal workforce.
I would need to know what that metric is actually measuring because I don't think it lines up with unemployment figures. You're talking about a totally different metric that I'm unfamiliar with. Not that I don't believe it. I don't know how you measure the Clinton administration to 2021. There's too many variables there for me to even get my arms around it.
The Clinton administration figure I gave was from the year 2000. Okay, it wasn't from 2000. Okay, and 21. But of course, there are changes. The size of the labor force is considerably larger now. Okay,
Yeah.
I express those numbers as percentages. Okay, I'm just saying that At the end of the Clinton administration, when the unemployment rate was very low as well,
Hmm.
taking into account the greater percentage of participation in the labor force, uh, that was a period where employment, the labor market, was tighter than it is now.
Yeah, and what they raised the minimum wage in what, 2003?
No, they raised the minimum wage, if I recall correctly, in 2007. They raised it to $7.25. That was one thing Nancy Pelosi did when she took over the House in 2007, when she took over the House for the first time. So she quickly passed, okay, a rise in uh, the wage, okay, the minimum wage.
So, but there's so many things, Joe. I'm just thinking about it right now. Like they had just passed the welfare laws. They hadn't really thrown everybody off right yet because he passed that right as he was walking out, which totally decimated so many people.
Oh no, the
I
welfare reform took place
Yes.
in like 1994, 1995. Oh, that was early.
No. When did
Um,
he take office?
he took office in 1993. Okay, and he was the president from
I didn't
1993
I
to
didn't think he did that in his first administration.
2001. I think he did the welfare reform in his first administration, but do a search on it and see.
I'm gonna look because I mean there were a couple of things going on, but I mean what I'm getting at though is like three strikes you're out was implemented. There were so many people that would have been part of the working class, eligible, able to work that like life just turned upside down. That was the beginning of the uh, prison industrial complex. That was the beginning of just so much oppression in that and wiping out you know Uh, ugh. So I'm just grappling. I'm having a hard time with apples to apples on that comparison. I get it. I get what you're saying with the percentage, but my mind goes into, well, is it really? And I don't mean to pick it apart. I'm just thinking about all this stuff.
Okay, it seems to me the labor force participation measure is more indicative of the reality, okay, of the economy than the unemployment rates.
Yes.
In other words, the U3 unemployment rate is a highly structured figure that includes excludes all kinds of people, who are but not employed, and the U6 unemployment figure also excludes people who should be included, who would like to have a job. Uh, what should be done, I think, is to adjust both of those figures relative to the labor force participation rate.
Okay, so let me just tell you this real quick,
Using
Joe.
previous times when that was very high, because those previous times give an example of what we could have.
Right, right. But let me just mark this because it is relevant now that I pull this up. Um, Census Bureau showed that between 1993 and 2000, the percentage of low-income single mothers with a job as a result of welfare reform grew from 58% to 75%, an increase of almost 30%. Yeah, okay. All right. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. It's good to know that and to have that comparison, and even better to understand what it means that there were lots of people who were driven into the labor force by the welfare reform.
But their standard of living actually was not improved.
But their standard of living was not improved. And the conditions for their children also not improved.
Right, because there was no way. I mean, what ended up happening was moms had to go to work, kids were home alone.
Kids, okay, were either home alone or they were in situations where it was necessary to pay for them to go to school.
Oh, yeah, their moms didn't have that kind of money. Usually they were home alone. They got, I mean, I know how this goes. I was living in that world back then.
Yeah, they were latchkey kids, right?
If you want to call them that, depended on whether or not your parents, locked the doors and you had keys.
Oh, okay, so back to Stephanie. So, do I think Congress should be working with the White House to pass immediate tax hikes or spending cuts in order to bring down inflation? She says, no. There's already more than enough fiscal tightening baked into the economy. What's needed now is a continued focus on repairing supply chains,
Yes.
a concerted effort to get vaccines to countries with low vaccination rates. Okay, why is that important? Of course, well, because these vaccines are not getting to a lot of other countries, and so these countries get into situations where some of them have to cut down production, and that involves disturbing the supply chains even more. But the more we have the variants, the more disturbances there are to the supply chains. Okay, by the way, it looks like we may be coming on another cycle where we have lockdowns in China. And if that goes forward, that's going to disturb the supply chains again and may lead to further inflation in other nations. Okay, a concerted effort to get vaccines to countries with low vaccination rates. Okay, a resolution to the war in Ukraine. No kidding, right?
Yeah, well, that should be number one. Yes.
Strategies to reduce gas prices and a plan to secure the global food supply in the face of looming shortages.
Well, figure out some diplomacy and we can fix half of it.
Well, I know that she's for that.
Oh, I know. I know she is. It's just it's been so poignant to me, Joe, that like nobody talks about inflation relating to the sanction boomerang. It's like nobody will speak upon it because I guess the way that this has all been communicated to me in, not so subtle ways is that you do not go against your own government in the middle of a conflict. Seriously?
Okay, from my point of view, screw it.
Yeah, screw it for
This
sure.
this country is not in the middle of a war that was declared by the Congress.
Exactly.
Are
And
not
and we don't run a good
at
history of that
war.
shit. Bullshit. It's all
We
bullshit.
are at war. A proxy war is not a war. Our people are not at risk uh,
Can I
um, in Ukraine unless they're there illegally.
Well, there are supposedly advisors there, although nobody said that to us, but I think we've all those of us that have like looked into this enough aren't surprised by that. Um,
Yeah, supposedly we have special forces who are, are guarding Zelensky. I've heard that.
well, that wouldn't surprise me any. They've probably been over there for 8 years. But I will say this about this narrative of you don't go against your government in the middle of a conflict. Okay, that would make sense if we had policy in place that was doing things like guaranteeing a better standard of living, more longevity for its citizens and the others who live here in this country with us, right? When was the last time that anybody heard anything coming out of these administrations lately that had anything to do with something other than bad news, tighten your belt, uh, you know, fall in line, behave yourselves,
Yeah,
uh,
right. To go
don't protest, blah, blah, blah.
to go back to uh, 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 the declaration, okay, of war thing.
Hmm.
It's one thing where you've gone through the process. There's been a debate. Things go through the Congress. Okay, they declare a war. It's one thing in that context to say you shouldn't be going against your government in the middle of a war, though.
Exactly. That's different because
I mean,
that's
I still disagree with that, but consider how we got into this war,
we walked away
Ukraine
from
war.
a we walked away from the
We
negotiations.
we pushed the Russians into a corner
Hmm.
for 20 years, and we undermined agreements that they had made with Zelensky's government. Okay, and they undermined agreements that, in part, were guaranteed by France, okay, and by Germany. They were party to those agreements as observers and people helping the two sides, okay, to reach agreements. And we said, but nothing doing. We don't like these agreements and we don't want you, the Ukraine, to implement them. So they basically helped the Ukraine to rip up a treaty. And all this was done behind closed doors. There was no debate in the United States. There was
Mm-mm.
no debate in Congress. It was all done within the executive branch by a small group, okay, of people. And if anybody thinks that I'm not going to talk against that, they don't know me. I am not going to be shut up when
Well,
that
and let's
thing
just
is going on. This is still a democracy, at
it,
least
well,
supposed
huh,
to be a democracy. Those of
yeah,
us who want it to be who want to be a democracy are going to fight for it to be a democracy by at least saying what we think and criticizing a government that is doing things in secret on our behalf without our consent.
exactly. And Joe, I think it's important for us to point some of these things out. When when the federal government used to have to come through Congress to have a vote on whether or not to engage in war, right? There was, and this we're going back to the 40s. The last time I think we ever went in legitimately. Well, no, they did go through Congress for the Iraq War, but they lied. They
No, no,
bold-faced
no.
lied.
No, no, no. It wasn't a declaration of war. There
No,
was
it wasn't, but they did have a vote.
authorization for the use of military force.
Yes, yes, it was. It was. But what I want to get out here onto the table is that the way that it's supposed to work, the way that politics is supposed to work, is that you don't get false narratives and misleading bullshit coming out of Washington. You're supposed to get a level of transparency that is, we are going to have to go to Congress to declare war or to enter into a war. And there would be debate on this, and you would have an opportunity to reach out to your representatives to let them know whether or not you like this. This is before they were all bought, okay? And there was actually a representative government so that when people did speak up, they actually would listen. None of that is in play right now. The house that is supposed to be the people's house hasn't been functioning as such for decades. And it's gotten worse in this last three administrations, even four, five. I mean, let's just be real. But it's gotten exponentially worse.
But since World War II, we have yet to declare war even one time
Yes.
in the midst of all these conflicts that
All
we've
this
been in
bullshit.
since this time, all done without the consent of the people for a declaration, okay, of war.
Which means, guys, and this is where this all ties back. The pessimism that I have that we are going to get our arms around how to take this economy from the brink is because what you will not hear in the mainstream media is that the sanctions that we thought were going to break the Russian economy didn't break the Russian economy, not even close.
Oh,
And
well,
they're
not only that. Okay, not only that. This whole sanctions regime, the whole sanctions idea,
is illegal.
the whole sanctions idea is a violation of international law.
Yes. Yes, it is.
We
Yes, it is.
agree to because it's collective punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Collective punishment is illegal. Okay, according.
And when they boomerang and they end up punishing your own sovereign people, and you won't get anybody to even utter a sound along that line, you know you've been duped,
Yeah,
really badly. And I am so disappointed in just about everybody on this one. We haven't heard it from one member of any representation in any forum, not a word. So here's where I'm going with this. In unison, it is the responsibility of everyone who feels that they serve a public purpose, the public purpose, and especially the MMTers, to not run away from this. We have got to take the bull by the horns and run with it. Because if we're the only ones that are going to be able to say this, that are going to have any reputable clout in saying this, these sanctions are collective harm that aren't working. They're bouncing back on us.
yeah, boomerang.
Yes, it's a boomerang.
Sanctions
They're
boomerang.
hurting the American people, and Biden knows it. And so does his whole economic forum. And now the feds are going to raise interest rates. Feds are going to raise interest rates. They're capping the purchase of securitized mortgage securities. Jamie Dimon came out and rang the fire bell, although very few people knew it because he was speaking in street call code. Boris Johnson's no confidence vote is all based on economic and foreign policy, and the two are not separate.
It's based on economic and foreign policy that failed.
That failed. And there is a split in the Tories, for goodness sake.
And now, by the way, speaking of the situation here, this failure is imposing hardships, okay, on us and this White House, this administration refuses to do anything about it because they're claiming that they're going to be fiscally responsible and they're going to reduce deficits.
Oh, my ass. You know
They,
what they aren't saying? They're afraid to do anything about this right now because it will reflect as a military failure on their part, and they're afraid they're going to lose the midterms. There
yes,
it is.
the other reason is because they can't do anything about it anyway because they got Manchin and Cinema there and they won't support.
Oh, my God. If I hear that excuse one more time, I'm going to vomit. You
Well,
twist their arms. You just twist their. If you do not know how to apply political pressure to
then
two
you should
senators in your
resign.
own party, you
And you
don't belong in the administration.
You
Period. The
should
end.
resign as the president of the United States if you
It's
don't know how to
pathetic.
apply
It's
that pressure.
pathetic.
Because you are pathetic. And by the way, he is a pathetic president.
He's
Absolutely pathetic president.
whether it is this is all on Joe Biden or not, and I think that you and I are both savvy enough to realize that it's not, right? There are lots of forces in this administration that, you know, They've all known each other for a very long time, but they obviously have marching orders, and wherever they're coming from, man, you don't step out of line. I think we all kind of can see this. This is new. It's new, but you don't introduce a bill for Medicare for all and then never talk about it again, and it goes, you know, underneath Rich and Neil's rear end, and you never bring it up, and you don't talk about it, even though all the wins that you got in Congress came because your candidates who won you the House, ran on Medicare for all. You think that's an accident? You think they wanted to shut up about that? If you think that, you need to concentrate a little harder on what might actually have caused it.
Right. And you also should understand that because we have this type of situation is why we both are supporting the dump the incumbents idea.
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
that is the way out, okay, of this.
Well, and when we all start saying things like, this doesn't add up, we see this. Boris Johnson's no confidence vote had directly to do with economic foreign policy and everything that's going on here, going on with all the NATO countries, all of this. And it's not just us that these sanctions are boomeranging on, Joe. It's all of Western Europe, it's Africa, and we can go into that too. And all of these things are exacerbating inflation.
Yes,
All
they
of it.
all are exacerbating inflation. Okay, getting back to Stephanie. Although I wouldn't prioritize deficit reduction, the White House is hoping to reach a deal with Congress that would raise taxes by more than enough to offset some proposed new spending. So that's even more ridiculous. He's got to raise taxes and take money out of the private sector to offset new spending that we need to keep the economy going. This is crazy. Well, I don't agree. We need to cut the deficit even further in order to bring
Well,
in.
who's he going to raise
Um,
taxes on, Joe?
the president is pushing it. I don't know yet who he's going to raise taxes on. I don't even think he's going to get the rise in taxes through this Congress. I don't think that's going to happen. Anyway, my plan to reduce the deficit, he says, would help reduce inflationary pressures and lower everyday costs
Prove it.
for families. Yeah,
Prove it.
who doesn't
Prove
like
it. Because
that?
it's never been proven.
Well, there's also the trade-off. Okay, in other words, it's not going to help them if you reduce inflationary pressures on them by taking their jobs. That's not going to help them.
Joe, that's the thing that nobody says. I mean, we say it, but if you raise interest rates and you tighten up capital, what happens inevitably is that you have layoffs. That is inevitable.
Sooner or later, you have layoffs, but right at the beginning, you don't reduce the inflationary pressures
No, you
because
don't.
the interest payments to the private sector that come from this. Okay, the interest payments to the private sector, the interest rates are raised, okay, by the Federal Reserve. And that means more money going to the bondholders in the private sector.
Which are the private sector.
Spending is inflationary.
And and you and I've talked about this too, Joe, but I think we need to start stipulating which sector in this private sector benefits and which sector loses. Because when you say private sector, it is really important that we make that distinction.
Okay, so let's make that distinction now. We know that when it comes to higher interest rates on bonds and treasury securities, the people who are benefiting from this are at the top of the private sector.
And they're corporations and they're not people.
They're both corporations and wealthy people.
Well, yes, but the corporations, the ones that are benefiting from this are not small businesses. They're not
Yeah,
medium
they're not
businesses.
small
They're
business,
large
large.
regional or market monopolies. And that is not you and I, the private sector. We're talking macro here.
That's absolutely true.
And again, we ignore the micro when we even speak. No wonder people can't figure this out.
So Biden says, my plan lets have Medicare negotiate the price of prescription drugs. We can cap the price of insulin at $35 instead of the hundreds of dollars for some families. Now, folks, I don't think he's going to get that through.
Isn't that Build Back Better, which we couldn't pass, and he let Manchin kill because he pretends that he can't manipulate him into doing something? Yes.
Right. So, in other words,
Yes.
he's bullshitting again right
It's
now.
full of shit.
Then he says, you want to bring down inflation? Let's make sure the wealthiest corporations pay their fair share.
Come on, man.
Come on, man. Even if Democrats don't ultimately vote for Biden's plan, it's clearly possible for lawmakers to dial back fiscal support, says Stephanie, when confronted with high inflation. Remember, Congress already massively tightened fiscal policy. As she said, $1 trillion of tightening of fiscal policy.
They're going to bring this economy to a screeching halt. And like I had said before, Joe, it wasn't predicated off of a stable stable economy. We're punching off of COVID and a reboot.
Yes, we are. That's what we're doing.
And I don't believe we ever actually recovered out of that. We've got pent up demand. That's really all it is.
Okay, so the last piece of Stephanie's thing here, she's talking about personal consumption expenditure, okay, inflation. That just dipped. Okay, it had been at something like 6.5%, and it just dipped to 6.3%. Let me see what the yellow here means in this. Oh yeah,
Core.
the core personal consumption expenditures had been at over 5%, 5.2% or something. It's now dipped, okay, in April, at the end of April, to 4.9%, and the PC itself dipped from roughly 6.5% to 6.3%. So there was a dip, okay, in April. And she says there are obviously some pretty big wild cards here. There's a Ukraine, Russia, China, but as Claudia Sam wrote in her Substack this morning, we're on track for core inflation in the second quarter to step down to around 4% at an annual rate from the 5% pace in the first quarter. And then she says Claudia spent many years working at the Fed, and she's right to note that the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, will carry on raising rates until it sees, quote, clear and convincing evidence that inflation appears to be heading back down to 2%. Stephanie says, I wish that wasn't the case. I'll explain why when I answer question 2, which is going to be pretty soon. And we'll bring the answer to question 2 to you when it occurs. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this. And I noticed that we've taken a lot of time to discuss this, which I think is good.
It is good.
Okay, because
we have to put it down to the practical application. Otherwise, it gets lost up here.
Yes, we have to put it down to the practical application, but nevertheless, in going through the practical application aspects, we also have illuminated a lot of the theory aspects, and that's important, I think, okay, as well. We won't have time to go through everything tonight. It's already 10:11, but what I'm going to move to now is a piece by Josh Bivens because it has some important ideas in it. It deals more with empirical evidence. So let's go into that. And important empirical evidence as well. Let's see, Josh Bivens. Okay, Josh Bivens is with the Economic Policy Institute. He's a real senior economist there, one of the better known people they have. And he does very good work. He would be classified as a post Keynesian economist. In some ways, he's close to the MMTers. In fact, in the economists for peace and security in that organization, on a number of occasions, he sat on the same panels with the MMTers. So
Are you going to read his article?
I'm going to go through some points in his article.
You're not. Are you going to put it up or no?
I did mean to put it up. I meant to share it, but it didn't get in there. So thanks. Thank you
You're
again for
welcome.
reminding me. Okay, so let me bring it up again so I can go through those points. Okay, he says the price of just about everything in the U.S. economy can be broken down into three main components of cost. These include labor costs, non-labor inputs, and the markup of profits over the first two components. He says good data on these separate cost components exist for the non-financial corporate sector. These companies that produce goods and services of the economy, which makes up roughly 75% of the private sector. Then he points out since the trough of the COVID-19 recession in the second quarter of 2020, overall prices in the non-financial corporate sector have risen at an annualized rate of 6.1%, a pronounced acceleration over the 1.8% price growth that characterized the pre-pandemic business cycle of 2007 to 2019. So he's saying that over those 12 years, there was an average of 1.8%, okay, price growth. And suddenly, due to COVID, we jumped to 6.1%. And he says, strikingly, over half this increase, 53.9% of the increase, can be attributed to fatter profit margins, with labor costs contributing less than 8% of this increase.
There you go.
This is not normal.
No,
From
it's not.
1979 to 2019, profits only contributed 11% to price growth and labor costs over 60%, as shown in Figure A below. Non-labor inputs, a decent indicator for supply chain snarls, are also driving up prices more than usual in the current recovery. So then he's got a Figure A. And look at this Figure A, how striking it is. Okay, the light blue bars are what was going on historically before COVID. So corporate profits were responsible for 11.4% of increase in prices between 1979 and 2019. This is 11.4%. But in the COVID period, that is the second quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of 2021, corporate profits are responsible for 53.9% of the price rise.
Mm.
Then the non-labor input costs, that's the proxy for supply chain problems, historically contributed 26.8% to growth in prices, but in the COVID period, it was 38.3%.
Which had
Almost
to do a lot with supply chain issues
right.
and shipping and all of that garbage. I mean, shipping costs are unbelievable. They more than doubled. And I know this because we had people moving back and forth from as soon as right when COVID started, we had people move to Europe, and their shipping costs were, you know, roughly 4 grand. When they came back, as soon as all this COVID stuff dissipated, or at least we pretended, their shipping costs were 3 times. Now, this is one instance, but then I talked to someone who is very, very involved and made a lot of money in shipping, and they told me that the prices have doubled, and depending on the day, they have no problem quoting you triple the cost. So that's a big part of it.
Yep, that's a big part of it. And then the bar for the labor costs. Okay, unit labor costs.
Well, I don't know about labor costs because they weren't paying anybody. Nobody was working, right?
Uh,
And they
but
were subsidized for labor as
but
well.
they still had the labor costs in some way to cover. But I'm not talking COVID
Oftentimes,
here. I'm not taking.
oftentimes though, operations went plummeted for a while or stagnated, which was part of the reason why they felt they could get away with raising prices and gouging as well. Like
Right,
there's so many
right,
factors in here.
right. There's so many factors, but to state the statistic, the blue bar says that from 1979 to 2019, 61.8% of the price rises were due to unit labor costs. 62%. But during the COVID period, less than 8% were due to labor costs, 7.9%.
Which makes sense, right? And that one thing I want to point out here, which should be an assertion on here, is this is a circumstantial economic crisis. This is not, again, pointing out that we are in a rebound where we never recovered. We never fixed our supply chain issues. As a matter of fact, we've exacerbated them. And I have to say this, although I hate to point this out, but I don't believe that inflation is going to dip. We haven't even measured the boomerang effect on the economy yet.
We haven't even measured it, but I do have a point to make, okay, about that as we go forward.
Okay.
Um, okay, so basically that's what I wanted to do, okay, with this particular article. In other words, those figures are quite clear. What's going on right now in relation to the increase of prices is not about the cost of labor.
Not even close.
Okay, it's about the supply chain issues and it's about the insane increase in corporate profits. And that has to be due to price gouging, of course.
And another piece of this inflationary puzzle is all of the relief that went to the corporations and never trickled down into the people. They made bank. The corporations, the bigger corporations, again, were in the highbrow sector of the private economy here, were subsidized out the yin yang on this stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely subsidized up the yin yang. Not only subsidized up the yin yang, but of course, the money cannon that was created for them, which they never used, gave them the backing they needed to see their stocks rise in price. And that also propelled their campaigns to buy their stocks back and
For
further
buybacks,
increase,
inflate
further
the
increase.
market.
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
In,
And Diamond was predicting a 20% correction in the market this year coming. The end of this year, I think he said.
well, he certainly could be right. I want to share one more thing for tonight. It's a piece by Bill Mitchell, who, if you watch MMT, Bill Mitchell is one of the big three, okay, of MMT, one of the three fathers. The other two, okay, are Randy Ray, okay, and Warren Mosler. from a strictly technical economic point of view, um, just as a matter, okay, of personal opinion, and this is nothing against what Randy Ray does. I love his books and his writing uh, is superior to almost everybody else's. He's a great analyst. Okay, and Warren Mosler has a wonderful intuitive feel for all things MMT. Many people would argue that he is the MMT father because he published the first synthesis, which is recognizable as a piece, okay, of MMT. But from a strictly technical point of view, and from the point of view of a prolific author, okay, and publisher, the best of the MMTers, okay, is Bill Mitchell. I don't think anyone would argue about that. So he put a piece out on June 4th to 5th. I'm sorry, on June 6th, 2022, on his blog. And I do want to share that with you. I didn't put this into the stream. Okay, and I'm not going through the whole thing. I just want to highlight just a couple of things from this. Okay.
Thank God for Bill Mitchell.
This comes from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. He watches the U.S. statistics, okay, even though he's an Australian, of course. I'm not going to go through all of these statistics.
But you got to read the title because it needs to be shouted from the rooftops.
You're right. U.S. labor market weakens a little. It is madness to be increasing interest rates in
Hello.
the environment. Yeah, Bill always lays it right out on the table.
Thank God. I love it.
He usually doesn't have catchy titles, but he has direct and devastating and long titles that really reveal what his things are about. Here in this blog, he lays out all kinds of statistics. He just gives you the statistics. He points out that the labor participation rate rose by 0.1 points to 62.3%. So I was mistaken before that when I said that it was at 63%. It was at 62.3% versus in the Clinton administration when it was at 68%. Okay, so that particular thing is there. The broad labor underutilization measure, the U6, rose 0.1 points to 7.1% as underemployment increased. So he's talking about a weakening of the labor market.
Yeah, there's 8 million new jobs out there and people have 4 of them.
He has another blog. Blog called "The U.S. Labor Market is in a Deplorable State," where I explain the differences in detail. I'm not going to go through that one here, but there's a link to that, okay, in this piece. So he talks about payroll trends, and okay, I'm not going to bore you with all of this, but I'm just going to highlight some conclusions as we move through this. Okay. So here he has a graphic that graphs the U.S. change in payroll employment in hundreds of thousands. It's a moving
3-month average. Yeah, moving average.
Right. Okay, it's a moving average. Okay, over 3 months. Okay, and okay, it shows that it's increased somewhat, but just began to go down. Okay, at the end. Okay, so that's interesting. So he says the next graph shows the same data in a different way. In this case, the graph shows the average net monthly change in payroll employment for the calendar years from 2005 to 2021. The red marker on the column is the current month's results. The final average for 2019 was 164,000. The final average for 2020 was minus 774,000. The final average for 2021 was 562,000. The average so far in 2022 is 488,000. So he's talking about the change in payroll employment. And when it's a positive number, it means the average so far in 2022 was 488,000 per month. That was less than the average for 2021, which was 562,000. And of course, 2020 was the year of the disaster, COVID disaster. And so the losses were minus 774,000 per month, the average losses during that time.
Which has not been recovered in either year yet.
Which
It's
is
not even close.
Has not been fully recovered, right?
So how can unemployment be at its lowest rate? That tells you that your KPI is not good.
If the unemployment is at its lowest rate, it's at its lowest rate because the labor force participation rate has declined. People have left the labor force.
Exactly, but it's that you have to know something to be able to understand that, because when they say unemployment is at its lowest rate ever, that makes everybody think that people are all back to work.
You're
And
right.
that's not the case.
That's right. It makes people think, oh, everything is hunky-dory. You have to know the change in the labor participation rate to know that has gone down and that the unemployment rate is so low because people have left the labor force.
Exactly, and this is all deceit, because it is a bad time right now for everybody, and we're coming out of something incredibly unstable and unprecedented since this revolution of industry. It's not industry, but the technology and service revolution that we entered into. None of this is good stuff. They'll spin it good because they're going to try and win this election, but it is not good.
Right. It is not good. The labor force participation rate should keep on going up. Okay.
And it's not.
Right. Okay, you can see in previous times, like in 2000, they have it here at 65%. Okay, I'm sure it was higher than 2000 then. It's the employment to population ratio. Oh, that's not the same as the labor force participation rate.
But employment to population, which we all know, it's, the number of people that it takes to float a household basically has a lot to do with the increase in wages across the board, not just in highbrow sectors,
Right.
right?
See that the employment to population ratio was at its highest roughly in 2000.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that was roughly at 65%. Now, that's not the same as the labor force rate. And the reason
No.
it's not is because the whole population, is not a part of the labor force. But roughly, I don't know, maybe 70% of the population, is part of the labor.
I don't even think it's that high. I think it's in the 60s, Joe.
No, I think it's roughly that high because the rest of the people are old people and children.
We went through this a little while ago. It's in the 60s. I know that for a fact, and it's not even in the high 60s.
Oh no, that's the labor force participation rate. That's in the 60s. What I'm saying is that there's a population figure.
Mm-hmm.
Some percentage of the population is the potential labor force.
There you go.
Okay, and that's roughly 70% of the total population. But then there's a percentage of the potential
There it is.
uh, um, um, um,
Labor force.
labor force that is actually part of the labor force. In other words, that's actually participating. Okay, that hasn't left the labor force.
And that's the graph we need to see over time.
Uh, that's the graph we need to see over time. We haven't seen that yet here. It may well be here though. Okay, but this is the employment to population ratio. And the reason why he picked that is because the population part of that ratio is more stable and steady over time. It changes more slowly. Okay, so he wanted something that had a denominator that changed more slowly. So that's why he picked that. BLS notes 3.6% for the third month in a row, and the number of unemployed persons was essentially unchanged, 6.0 million. These measures are a little different from their values in February 2020, 3.5% and 5.7 million, respectively, prior to the coronavirus pandemic. In May, the number of long-term unemployed, those jobless for 27 weeks or more, edged down to 1.4 million. This measure is 235,000 higher than in February 2020. That's the month prior to the onset, okay, of COVID. Of course, we had a little COVID in February of 2020, but it was very small numbers. Long-term unemployed accounted for 23.2% of all unemployment persons in May. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. Let's see. BLS official unemployment rate. This is the U6 unemployment rate.
Oh, look at that spike up and then that spike down.
Yeah, the spike up was uh, for COVID.
Mm-hmm. And the spike down was we're kicking you off.
It spiked up for 14.4%. And then the spike down was people who got other jobs of one kind or another.
Oh, and okay, but also withdrawing the unemployment benefits.
All right. Okay. So I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This graphic is the official unemployment rate. Okay. It's the U3 rate. It's not the U6 rate. Uh, the next graph shows the BLS measure, the U6 rate, which is defined as total unemployed plus all marginally attached workers plus total employed part-time for economic reasons as a percent of all civilian labor force plus all marginally attached workers. And that was the underutilization rate. And that went up to about 23% at the height of COVID, and then went down and is still at 6%. And you can see in the last month it went up very slightly at the end of the curve. Okay, then he deals with ethnicity here, but I'm going to try to get to some of the conclusions now. This is a very, very long piece. As you see, he just does a tremendous amount of work in a short time. The only way he could possibly get something like this done is because he is hugely well organized, okay, and disciplined. He has a center, but he doesn't
Yeah.
have many people in the center
Well, and this is what he does, and this is what he's done for a long time.
for a long time. Yes. Okay. What are wages doing in the U.S.? Average hourly raises for all employees on private non-farm payrolls rose by 10% or 0.3% to $31.85 in May.
By 10 cents.
Over the past 12 months, average hourly earnings have increased by 5.2%. In May, average hourly earnings of private sector production non-supervisory employees rose by 15 cents, or 0.6%, to $27.33. Then he's got a table by sector, average earnings, okay, inflation adjusted earnings. So now what you have to do is look at the inflation adjusted earnings. And you see that for each sector, the inflation adjusted earnings are negative. In other words, the real wages fell during this period, even though the average hourly earnings in the private sector rose by 5.2%.
Yeah.
When they're inflation adjusted, they actually fell by 3% because inflation exceeded the rise, okay, in wages.
So all these tweets that we see that people are screaming we have to get wages under control, go beat them up every time you see them.
Well, you can see that wages are dampening inflation because the workers are losing ground.
Yes, exactly. But I've seen the argument today, Joe, that we've got to get wages under control.
No, that's a bullshit argument. It's a
Yeah,
bullshit.
I know. But it just shows you how absolutely blatant the lies are that are out there.
Yes. Yes. The propaganda is just awful.
There's nothing but it.
And
I
it's
can't find truth anywhere.
totally incorrect when you look at the data. I think there's truth in Bill Mitchell's blog.
Oh well, yeah, but I'm just talking about your mainstream,
Oh, I know.
what is considered, someplace you can go and count on information. I mean, it's gotten absurd.
Right. So you can see, and this particular graphic here I'm showing you is a real critical one. It shows that the real average hourly earnings, which were at 100 in December 2019, they rose to 110. And I'm not sure what month that was. It was
That's a year. They're going year by year.
yeah, year by year. That was in most probably early in 2020. Let's see if I can hit this. Hit this if there's a value to it.
There's a spike there too because of the decennial.
Yeah, there's a spike there, right? Okay, but after the spike, you see the real wages are going down. And they end up lower than where they began to go up. So the overall effect of everything was for workers to lose ground by 2000, okay, in 22. Workers have enjoyed hardly any real wage growth since 1970, real wages rising by just 6.3%, whereas productivity growth has risen by 162%. So if things were normal, if they were following the way they were before 1970, wages rose with productivity in the period from 1945 to 1970. And then since 1970, well, you see that productivity rose, 20 times. let's see, 10 times would be 60%, 20 times would be 120%. Well, actually, more than that. Uh, well, that's amazing. This depicts the failure of capitalism to serve the best interests of the people, says Bill. There has been a massive redistribution of national income away from workers towards profits over this long period. You see, this is a favorite graphic that people are always showing. Starting in 1970, how the wages fail to keep up with the productivity rises. Okay, now that gap, those are the profits the employers are making, and that's going into their pockets.
Well, and there's also a piece of this which I would love to see separated out, which is the mass entrance of women into the workforce. Because why? Oh, they had access to abortion and they could have their own credit.
Right.
And women were getting paid 63 cents on the dollar and a lot less than that when they first started entering the workforce. And I would love to pull that out of there because I've said this before, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to say it again. Most women don't know what's coming when Roe v. Wade gets overturned.
So here are some conclusions. Oh, and by the way, even now, the gap in wages from females to male is something like 78 cents on the dollar.
No, it's not even that high. I mean, it's not even that. It's not even that. It's bigger than that. It's not. I don't think we're in 78 yet. I don't think so. I may be wrong, Joe, but I don't think so.
It's still appreciable.
It's yeah. Oh hell yeah, it is.
It's huge. It's huge. And theoretically, there shouldn't be any gap at all. The U.S. That gap is a direct measure of injustice in the labor market.
Well, they're gonna fix it.
And make it even worse.
Yeah.
They're planning to do. The U.S. labor market slowed a little in May 2022. The U.S. labor market is still 822,000 jobs short from where it was at the end of May 2020. The employment population ratio is still down on the May 2020 peak. There are no fundamental wage pressures emerging at present, despite the spikes in inflation arising from supply chain constraints. Real wages are falling. Okay, but keep that conclusion in mind. No fundamental wage pressures emerging at present, despite the spikes in inflation arising from supply chain constraints. The U.S. labor market is still some way from being at full employment. Bill says in his traditional way, he ends all his blogs, that is enough for today. He says it certainly was enough for today, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. He's good.
The U.S.
He's
labor
really
market
good.
is still some way from being at full employment. Yes. Not at full employment. The inflation is not due to wages. It is due to price gouging.
And
It is
sanctions.
supply chain problems and due to sanctions. And by the way, all these analyses of what inflation is due to do not include the role of government, or perhaps I should say the lack of role of government,
Or the poor
because,
policies implemented by government.
because theoretically, according to post-war values that came in at the end of World War II, it's supposed to be the case that the government is responsible for employment and the closeness of approach to full employment, and also inflation.
Mm-hmm.
If inflation is high, it used to be generally accepted that inflation is high because the government failed to do what it was supposed to do.
Their
So,
job.
so, okay, in the case we're seeing now, where there are supply chain disruptions and where they're price gouging, driving the inflation, what are the failures of government that have contributed to this inflation? Well,
I got one.
go ahead.
Lack of regulations, for one, huge one. Corporate consolidation, another big one. Uh, and along with that comes your corporate representation.
Right. Okay. And to be also absolutely plain about this as well, when we have had other times where we had to bring inflation under control and where there was either substantial success or at least some limited success. During the Second World War, there were wage and price controls
And rationing.
and savings bond sales
Hmm.
that kept inflation within bounds. It was relatively small during the years of the war, in spite of the huge deficits which the government was running for the whole war. Still, inflation was kept under control for the whole period of the war by wage and price controls and by selling savings bonds and by regulations. Yes,
Hmm.
regulations. What could this administration have done with respect to regulations?
Anything other than what they did.
When they first came into power, they could have passed an excess profits tax right away. That's what FDR would have done. They could have passed wage and price controls. That's what FDR would have done. We have examples of this, of what was done in the past and successes. And those were things that Joe Biden failed to do, because when Joe Biden came into office and before, he promised the big interests that nothing would fundamentally change. And he kept that promise instead of working for the American people.
Well, the Fed kind of broke it on him, though.
The Fed kind of broke it on him, and
I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but they said they're going to do it.
okay, I have to note here, I have to note here that during the Second World War, the Fed worked hand in glove with the Treasury Department.
Hmm.
They were not
Hmm.
independent. They were controlled by FDR and his government,
And they actually knew what the hell they were doing.
and they knew what the hell they were doing, but they closely collaborated with the federal government, with the executive branch, to keep inflation under control. In this crisis, we don't have that.
No, and it is the worst possible time with the wild variables, outlying scatter plots associated with the economy, as it were,
And
to
with the
throw
war,
on top of it a proxy war.
a
Like,
proxy war that was a war of choice.
it's
Okay,
beyond. It's
I know
beyond.
the Russians started it by sending their troops in,
Well,
but
yeah,
where the
we
choice
cornered them.
was in pushing the Russians to the wall, in
Mhm.
disturbing and overthrowing the Minsk agreements.
And abandoning diplomacy.
Those things were Biden's choice. His foreign policy establishment, okay, actually did that. And that has caused the sanctions boomerang
And
and
all of
further
his
added to inflation.
and everybody who went to bat to keep this, keep the this is what we're going to do. Boris Johnson got a recall yesterday, and he's a lame duck. He's not long for this world. He lost, or he won that, but the margin that he cleared it by was unprecedented. Theresa May uh, had fewer no confidence votes than he did, and she was out in 6 months. She
Yeah,
had 117. He pulled in 148. He's done.
he pulled in 148. And by the way, some of the election analysts there
Hmm.
were suggesting that if he got 141 votes against him, then that would be enough to damage him as a prime minister and ensure that he'd be leaving soon. And there were 148 votes against him, not
And when
141 votes.
and the first one to resign was his anti-corruption czar. And if you haven't seen it, his resignation letter was scathing,
Yes, it was.
scathing.
It was scathing. Right. And not only did he write that letter, but he voted with 148 people to get rid, okay, of Boris Johnson.
Well, he resigned.
He resigned from the government, but he was still in parliament.
Yes, he resigned from his position. Yes,
Right.
exactly.
So he was still part of the party, and he voted against Boris Johnson. He
Hmm.
was one of the 100, okay, and 48.
And there were many other, well, many. I'd say maybe 6 or 7 all up who resigned from his cabinet, if you want to call it that.
Right. Okay, let's check out, okay, a few of the comments before we leave. Okay, because it's getting late. And you
I
have a
think
big
it
day
is.
tomorrow, don't you?
I do. I have a really big day tomorrow, but that's all right. Let's just. I mean, I'm gonna hang out. I'm gonna have a hard stop in 6 minutes. Go, Joe.
Okay, go. Go, go, go. Okay. Lots and lots of comments. Lana made a comment about Jesse Ventura, my former governor Jesse. I like him. He's a little too much with conspiracy sometimes, and he's not
I love his conspiracy analysis.
economically literate, but is entertaining, and I think he wants good change. I think so too. He's a good guy. He proved it as governor of Minnesota, didn't he? And Ghostart says, mint the dam, hashtag OCF. Well, it's actually mint the damn coin and pass the OCF, overt congressional financing. Oh, by the way, there was a paper done last week by some people, some of the MMTers, over in the UK who had studied what actually happens in the UK when the government uh, creates money and spends money. And the conclusion was, okay, that under authority that Parliament had created, and I believe the year was 1866, that the government voted itself the authority at that time in 1866 to tell the Bank of England to give it the dollars that it chose to appropriate and place those dollars in the Treasury. So they were already doing overt congressional financing starting in 1866, and they have it now. Now, of course, for much of that time, they were on the gold standard, so they were limited by the gold standard. But after the gold standard went in 1971, they have had overt congressional financing since that time. I don't think they know how to use it, but well, they have it. Anyway, Lana says Mark Zandi, never heard of him, but Google says he's an Iranian American economist. Is the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, 63 years old, from Atlanta, Georgia, educated at the University of Pennsylvania and Wharton, Pennsylvania. The Wharton School is part of the
Hmm.
University of Pennsylvania. He is one of the best macroeconomists uh, in the country, and he's honest in the sense that he does the analyses and he reports the results. Doesn't try to shade things. He's never tried to shade things. He collaborates with the MMTers sometime, like for example, the study of student debt. Okay, they did one of the models they exercised for that was Mark Zandi's model. So he lent them the use of his model for that. The other model they used was the FAIR model, but he's very well known for his models and for how good his models are compared to the Congressional Budget Office. Everybody thinks he's a lot better than the Congressional Budget Office. That may not be too high a bar. So Jesse had this interview with the Vanguard. He did say the Greens snubbed him over Howie. Oh, I didn't know that. That was interesting.
Yeah, you should watch the Vanguard pod that was today. It was interesting.
I'll bet it was. Steve Wolpern said, and Bernie gave him a cold shoulder. Steve says, breaking points to the show about corporations buying trailer parks and raising rents. We are screwed. We are not screwed. We have to turn around and start doing the screwing. And what the screwing means in this case is that we have to get in our legislators at both the state level and the federal level. We got to get money out of politics. That's the key to it all. Okay, we just have to do that. I'm not saying we shouldn't do other things. I'm not saying we shouldn't have the movements. Yeah, we should have all those things at once. But at the end, we have to get the money out of Congress so that people who are in Congress can only turn to ourselves for support. That's the key to their becoming responsible, and that's the key to their achieving public purpose. Honey, hey Bonnie.
She got headphones on?
Yeah, she has headphones on. Okay, I think we can deal with that. I don't think it's a problem. That's beyond our scope. So John B says canceling, freezing 300 billion in Russian USD reserves is blatant robbery of properly earned proceeds of trade. Yeah, it is. It's robbery. Yeah, it's piracy. Except it's not on the high seas. The U.S. is revealed as a dishonest trader and a breaker of international contracts. China has 3 trillion in USD reserves they must offload. Yes, but they still have to be careful about the offloading of the reserves because, of course, it's an international market. And if they offload the reserves too fast,
And what is their incentive not to?
That's
Nothing.
a good question.
None.
A good question.
Zero. And we did this to ourselves.
Yeah. Why should China accept US dollars in exchange for further trade? I don't know.
That would be silly if they don't want to
so.
crush us.
Prepare for shortages of Chinese sourced imports. China is now spending their USDs on Belt and Road initiatives. John B., I think you're right. The USD has ceased to be a reliable reserve currency that has serious long-term negative implications for the U.S. economy. Cheap imports will disappear in the U.S., driving inflation even higher. Well, I don't know about that, because in the end, that might be good for us because we would have to start to manufacture again. And I think we really need to do that.
We have to repatriate so much, and they talk about it in the administration like it's just going to happen tomorrow.
Yes, I know, and it's not. It's going to take
It's
us,
not. It's going to take decades to get it all back.
well, maybe not decades, but probably 1 decade.
We're
It's
going to have to retool it. We're
Yep.
going to have to put stipulations on them coming back. I mean, you want the Green New Deal to work? You're going to repatriate dollars, or we're going to tax the living hell out of you. You're going to get back here and do production, and you're going to be required to go carbon zero.
Okay.
Ta-da!
So somebody who claims to be Kerberos Media Productions, that must be Shane, says, Joe, please check your messenger. I sent you something very important to read at the end of the show. Don't think you saw it, though. Okay. So you want me to do it at the end of the show? I'll be happy to read it.
We're there.
Let me check my messenger here and see where it is. So who sent me the messenger? Who sent me messenger?
Probably Shane.
Probably I'm looking for Shane now.
What is this? Democrats and a couple of Republicans just killed the DeVos school voucher program on the House floor. Ooh,
That was Betsy DeVos's program, I guess.
they just killed it. I didn't even know there was something introduced. I mean, that's a good thing in my mind, but I didn't even know that was going on.
Right. Let me find that damn thing. Let me see what's going on here. Justice Work Team. Sherry. Oh, Shane wants me to read something from Modern Money Lab.
What if we mint the coin and Joe Biden forgets where he put it? It won't ever go to Joe. It goes straight from the mint to the Treasury, right? Is that right? It doesn't go to the reserve. It goes to the Treasury.
Right.
But it doesn't have to pass to the Fed first, right? There's no big deal there. Or does it? We talked about this a long time ago, Joe, and I don't remember.
Where the coin goes is it stays at the Fed.
Oh, it does say the Fed. Okay.
Stays in the vault. In other words, it's deposited as money at the Fed. The Fed puts it in the vault and credits the face value to the Mint's account. Okay, so if 100T coin were minted, there would be 100T in reserves that would be
The
added.
Fed could add to the Treasury. Yep.
Uh,
Yep.
at that point, the Fed has the authority to sweep the Mint's account for the seigniorage. And the seigniorage is the face value of the coin minus the costs for minting the coin, okay, and getting it up to the Fed, roughly about $3,500 to $4,000. So the amount swept into the Treasury account would be just under the $100 trillion. MMT Tuesdays, I am told to read, is proudly supported by Modern Money Lab, an organization founded by economists Stephen Hale and Philip Lawn, and activist Gabby Bond. Modern Money Lab and Torrance University are running online graduate courses in MMT and ecological economics starting in September this year. That's 2022. You don't have to have a conventional economics degree to apply. And if you're interested, Stephen and Gabby will be happy to answer all your questions. To find out about the courses, go to www.modernmoneylab.org. AU what I think I'm going to do here,
Share that screen. So they are sponsoring and supporting us,
yes, they're supporting us. And we, of
which
course,
is wonderful. Thank you, Stephen Hale, and Gabby Bond.
all right, I am going to paste this into our comments here so people have not only heard it, but also can see it in these comments. Jesus. Somebody added some. Let me see if I can get rid of this adult dating stuff. I'm just going to block that user.
There you go.
Okay. So let me add comment. Okay, there it is. What I just read. Is it there? Should be there in a second. It's still spinning around.
You did get it in the comments. It showed up in the comments.
Yes. That is what I had to do, and I did read it as well. So that is just about done. I think we're
Good job, Joe.
okay. I think that we are ending at this point.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.
And thank you, Lisa, for a wonderful show.
Thank you, Joe. It was really good. This was a good one. We
Yeah.
need to just start. We need to just.
Oh, you faded out. Your sound faded out. I'm not sure why. No, you're still faded out. I do not know why. Oh, your mic is not in there. Hang on a second. Let's see if I can unmute you. No, it's coming from your side. Okay, Lisa, good night. Okay, sorry about that, folks. I don't know what happens. Sometimes Lisa's mic but goes off. John B. says U.S. government is exacerbating U.S. supply issues with its lack of investment in domestic production, raising tariff sanctions on external supply. Elitist greed and hubris has prevailed. Okay, a disease. John B., you're absolutely right again. Absolutely right again. Sherry Wise, good show, Joe and Lisa. Thank you, Sherry. Steve Wilbrand says polls are closing here in Los Angeles. I wonder what the voter turnout will be, as I heard it was real low as of this morning. Vote counts are coming in now. People are over voting. I'm about there too. Okay. Oh, what the hell? I blocked this guy and he's still able to come in. Why? Block user. Okay, guys. Okay, guys, I love you all, as Kay says. And have a wonderful night. I'll be back tomorrow. I don't know if Lisa will be able to make it tomorrow night, but just in case, she's still going to be on the promo. She is in the last stages of, well, her mother-in-law recently died. And so she has a funeral to go to. There's still some chance she'll be able to make it tomorrow night and or Thursday night, but the likelihood is she won't be able to make it. But I will send her a link just in case. Tomorrow night, I will be showing a second interview I had with Regis Tremblay on seeking the truth about the Russian, Ukraine situation. We have talked about that, and tomorrow night I'm going to play it on the show and stop it and make further comments as Lisa and I did last Wednesday. So I hope you'll come for that. I think it's going to be very interesting and very fascinating. Then on Thursday, we're going to have the Dump the Incumbent show, and we're going to go over in some detail the California results and also the New Jersey results. And Lana says that first interview with Tremblay was good. Yeah, I thought it was really good too. I think Lisa thought, since she's already seen it, that the second interview was even better. So hopefully you will think so too tomorrow night. In the meantime, I'm going to end the broadcast. And again, I thank you all for coming. And good night.